Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I want to talk about two books I read in the past few months that I really loved. The first is The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson, and the second is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I'm going to talk about these books as their own specific, unique things, but there are kind of a few important commonalities between them. They were both released this summer, they're both horror novels, and they both have these really interesting heroines who, like, as heroines in horror novels often are contending with issues related to, like, patriarchy and racism, but like in very different settings. So let's start with The Year of the Witching. The Year of the Witching is about Emmanuelle Moore. She's living in this very rigid puritanical society called Bethel, which is ruled by this dude named the Prophet. He's married to a bevy of wives, including at the beginning of the book, he's about to get married to one of Emmanuelle's friends. Emmanuelle herself is biracial, and that coupled with other parts of her family history make her somewhat of an outcast. But what really sets her family on edge is that she is drawn to the Darkwood, a forest that is forbidden naturally because of the witches. So of course, inevitably, Emmanuelle finds herself in the Darkwood, and while she's there, she learns more about the witches that are there, she learns more about her family history, and she learns more about how this all ties into a series of plagues that Bethel is facing. I had not heard about this book at all until I saw a tweet about it. I think it was from the author Alyssa Cole. I think she might have retweeted something about it like on the day it was being launched or like the night before it was being published, and I just like saw it and I was like, this sounds amazing. Like I really want to read a dark witchy story. And so, you know, this is a horror novel, so you'd expect some darkness, but I do want to like say outright that there are some very violent and misogynist systems and individual behaviors that are being explored in this book, and that includes sexual assault of a child. It is not super vivid in descriptions of those things, especially the sexual assault, but it is there. Outside of those darker themes, it is more gory. It is definitely pretty vivid. And given that this is a book that features like its own set of plagues and pandemics, that is also another thing to be on the lookout for given, you know, the state of the world right now. I was really in the mood for something that was going to be dark and also like really lean into it. And so I really love this book because I appreciated how much it embraced a lot of the darkness that's at the center of it, especially with relation to like this puritanical dystopia that's like kind of shaping the center and the setting of everything, as well as like the witchy outliers that you know you're going to learn more about. But I also underestimated this book because when I started it, I was like, you know, I've read my share of like books with a puritanical society and a bunch of witches. Like I've seen the various feminist and unfeminist iterations of that. So like I feel like I have a sense of where this book is gonna go. I don't think you can really have a book about witches in a puritanical society without it being in part about patriarchy. That's in everything like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina to like The Crucible. And so like, of course, I expected this book to have that. And The Year of the Witching, when I started reading it, felt like it was going down very familiar storylines about like how witches would play into this idea of resistance and whatnot, especially like for the first quarter or so of the book. But then it sort of made the switch where it became clear that the book was willing to be a little bit more murky about people's complications, especially women's complications in response to an ideologically rigid and oppressive society. There are different ways of surviving in this book, and they don't always feel clean or inherently virtuous just for existing. In fact, some of them uphold the patriarchal system at the core of this world, and then others create more violence in response to it. But I think what the book is ultimately trying to understand is how like violent and unjust systems create these responses that in turn will sometimes perpetuate it even as they're trying to survive that initial framework. And I think this book is both like sympathetic but also capable of like condemning these varied survival mechanisms while also trying to figure out if there's a way to break these cycles of harm. With that said, there are times where it felt like the book had so many thoughts and ideas going into it that they don't all fully get to be explored. I think this is Henderson's debut novel, and so it sort of has that kind of debut feel of like there are so many like things going into the writing of this novel because it is the first one. And so the ending in particular I found to be a bit rushed because there were like multiple threads that got resolved within like a few pages of each other, and there are these pretty complicated things to try to unravel, and so they don't really fully get unraveled for me because they happen so quickly. And it also kind of creates this disconnect that makes all of these like huge important moments in the context of the story feel a little bit mushy. It felt a little bit like a book that should have been longer, but I would also be really happy if there was a sequel that explores this world more. There's also a romance to the story that will feel especially familiar if you've read like a lot of YA romances, which I don't say to like denigrate this romance. It just has a lot of familiar beats. Ezra, the romantic interest, he's got that sort of like, I don't know, slick but broody dude thing kind of going on. Like he's sort of a forbidden love interest sort of thing. And I resented him at first, especially because the beginning of the book felt so sapphic, like especially when we're like finding all these witches and stuff. And so I was kind of like, do we need a dude in this story, you know? But he actually grew on me, which is kind of unusual for this type of hero. So like, I was kind of surprised by that. I think it's because he kind of does stuff, and he actually does have like a really interesting conflict of his own that he's dealing with. And my only complaint there at the end was that I think a lot of the changes that he has to undergo don't get to be fully explored because it's not really his story, which is not a complaint about this book, just that there is something there that I think would also be super interesting, and that like is part of why I want a sequel, because I think related to a lot of those themes of like violence and cycles and all of these things, like there is a lot there to like unpack, and I would really, really love if we get to unpack that in a future book. So the other book I wanted to talk about is Mexican Gothic, which is about a debutante named Noemi who gets a disturbing letter from her cousin who just recently married into an English family that once owned mines but has since fallen into hard times. Noemi's father asks her to figure out what's going on, so he sends her off to High Place, the mansion owned by that family, that English family. When she gets there, surprise, things take a turn for the Gothic. The house is creepy, the family is unsettling, and Noemi is just trying to figure out what's going on with her cousin, and especially her cousin's husband who keeps creeping on her. And there's this patriarch who has this like tendency, habit, whatever you want to call it, of being a fetishizing eugenicist at her. There's this sort of matriarch who keeps getting mad at her for breaking really dumb rules. There's just all of these sort of like unsettling things that keep happening. I am a recent discoverer of Silvia Moreno Garcia thanks to a lot of people on BookTube, and especially Gods of Jade and Shadow, and I also love Gothic horror. So as soon as I heard she was putting out this book, I was like 100% in. And I love the way that she took that Gothic horror setting, especially that like very specific English Gothic horror setting, and transported it to Mexico, where it takes on even more insidious connotations of exploitation. And the book really explores this from the eugenics angle. This book is set in the 1950s, and eugenics was in this disturbing, I mean, eugenics was always in a disturbing place, but like in its timeline, it was in this weird place where people had like kind of realized like, okay, eugenics is this very racist and baseless like fantasy that basically like the Nazis have used. And so some people were kind of moving away from it, but there were also really strong adherents who were trying to find new ways to kind of carry the torch of eugenics into polite society. And one of the things that I love about a particular type of Gothic horror is when it's used to like explore the horrific trappings of the privileged and the things that they do to cling to like a vague notion of power. And for the men of High Place, what they're clinging to is biology, but a false notion of it driven by patriarchy and racism. And this all makes Noemi a really compelling heroine to deal with all that. She is herself a glamorous, charming debutante, and she's very aware and deliberate about how she wields those things. She's also smart and educated, and those are all functions of her own personality, but they are also a result of her upper class upbringing, which makes her somewhat privileged, but also is a threat to many of the notions barely holding High Place together. And so there's this really unsettling tension between like desire and repulsion throughout this book from like a lot of different characters, and I really loved reading that. Like it is very like unsettling, like I said, and there are ways in which it's like very disturbing and uncomfortable, but I think that's like a part of the horror that the book is creating. And I really liked reading Noemi figure out like kind of her way through this very unsettling situation. The book kind of takes a turn in the last third, and it's in ways that looking back, I'm like, oh, okay, I see the things that were building to this, but it took me completely by surprise the first time around. And I don't want to spoil it, but I'm gonna just say that it was very weird, and it was also very much up my alley, and I'm kind of obsessed with it. And so I'm debating, I'm not sure if this is gonna happen, but I might make a video in the future that'll be more spoilery, kind of diving into that last third, because I think there's a lot of stuff here that she's doing with how she uses science and nature in relation to the horror that is really, really interesting. My one minor complaint is that towards the end, as things are getting revealed, it kind of feels like there are things that are getting over-explained. And I think part of it was just that there was so much action that needed to happen, but it would get paused to kind of explain what was happening in relation to like the big reveal. And so it didn't always flow as well as I found that the rest of the book did. But this is a thing that I think is always a hard thing to pull off in like horror and sometimes also in fantasy and sci-fi books as well. So it's a relatively minor complaint for me in the grand scheme of the whole book. So these are both of the horror books I read and loved this summer. I guess we're heading into fall now. I'm wearing a sweater and it's the last week of August because apparently right now it feels like autumn here. So I don't know, maybe we're already in fall. I don't know. So the point is that if you are a person who likes your seasonal reading, I think both of these books are perfect for fall, very good for the next few months, so I highly recommend them. Let me know if you guys have read these, what you thought about them, and if you have recommendations for other horror novels that you wanna leave my way, do that as well.